Hey guys, welcome back. So now getting into Jonathan Hickman's new run of X-Men, which just feels fresh just saying it out loud. And he's done a pretty brilliant job of just bringing us a new take and all the new concepts we've been taught through House of X and Powers of 10. But there's also a few things within this first issue that put me in the mind of what is to take place in the future within your recent issues of Black Panther. So now let's get into it. But first, if you're new to the channel, be sure to subscribe to catch the spills every week. And don't forget to hit that bell up top so we can squat up in the comments for the first hour. Alright, so at this point in time, just starting off, and just to be clear like what time we're in, with all the X-Men time jumping that we've been doing lately, but here we're pretty much just picking up after the events of House of X. And that's not to say that we don't or we won't get any more time jumping, because we do get a bit of flashbacks within this issue, but it's not like the crazy back and forth like we got before. But when we jump in and we see Storm and Cyclops who are going to the last Orcis base that's on Earth, there's a few things that we find out here. Because with the X-Men going on their different missions and taking down these different locations, each one of these missions has got more and more dangerous, mainly because of the desperation of Orcis, whose organization is being cleaned off the face of the earth. And with their perspective and their belief that what they're doing is actually saving mankind, it has escalated to the point to where they're willing to die to stop the mutants from keeping them from accomplishing their goals. And even though the X-Men don't use lethal force towards them, Orcis is quite the opposite. So if they let their guard down for even a second, it's a wrap. And for Orcis, it's even reached the point to where they place their attacks on the heroes like they don't even plan for themselves to make it out alive. And when the X-Men make their way through here, we see some pretty crazy examples of that. But as Storm and Cyclops make their way through, they eventually notice that these soldiers at Orcis, and at least the remaining ones who are still conscious, they all fall back into one location, which Storm mentions could be only one of two things, with the first being that, okay, either these guys are extremely well trained and they can defend themselves with the worst tactic ever with grouping all up in one spot, or this is a last ditch effort for them to protect something. And that's one of those things where it's like, okay, it's gotta be option B. But as soon as this happens, we also get the arrival of Magneto and his daughter Polaris. And Polaris takes down these guys pretty quick, pulling up the floor, pushing them to the side. But when they shift their attention to what these Orcis troops were protecting, they discover that it's behind a vibranium door, which Cyclops can't break with his concussive force because the vibranium is just constantly absorbing his optic blast. And so now because of this, because it's vibranium, Magneto's like, step to the side, I'll handle this. And Magneto just rips the vibranium door to shreds. And I'm just looking at this like, oh, so you just ripping vibranium apart now. Because if you guys remember, we talked about Magneto versus Black Panther and how at the time Magneto had mentioned that T'Challa's vibranium suit was protecting him from Magneto just tearing him inside out. But now it's like Hickman is making it clear that for whatever reason, Magneto can manipulate vibranium. And at this point after House of X, this could be for a number of reasons. Whether he's been given a new body with some new abilities and more or less an upgrade in ferromagnetism, which means that he'd be able to shift the electrons within the atoms like figure B from whatever state they were previously in with vibranium. Because for magnetism to actually move something, these electrons had to line up in the same direction within their domain. And so now I didn't go to school for magnetics and magnetism, like that's not what my degree is in, but I would love for us to get a much deeper explanation to this. Because when we see it happen, you can tell like Hickman went out of his way to make it clear, to show us as the reader like, okay, this is a thing. But so now on the other side of this door, Dr. Mars and the other employees from Orcis, they take one of those crazy turns which we were talking about earlier, and in their case, they fight the mutants who are the next stage in evolution, and they inject themselves with a serum that converts themselves back to primates, which just goes to show you how bad these guys are fighting the future, with them doing this and going as far to turn themselves into primal animals in order to go after these mutants. And when this happens, once again, Magneto's like, I'll take it from here, and he fights them off so the others can proceed forward. And when the others get in, they find multiple stasis tubes to where all of them hold mutants except for one. And to the one that's not holding a mutant, they come to find out that this one was actually containing a post-human, which really feels like your reference from Children of Tomorrow from the 1610 universe. And when they discover her, it's kind of brushed over here, but I'd have to say I really feel like what Hickman's doing, which could very well connect with the maker and him bringing this over from the 1610 universe, to whom with at that time he was also working with AIM, and as we know, a part of Orcis is comprised of AIM employees. But in addition to this, like we had seen in human powers of 10 in year 1000, it was then that we learned that machines and the Sentinels, that they were just an element to buy time, and that the true purpose of what mankind was doing, it led more towards engineering their own ascension to something greater than what nature had provided with mutants. So I wouldn't be surprised if Hickman had found a way to tie the two together. But essentially when Magneto comes back, the girl translocates, she gets away, and there's a bit of suspicion with Magneto getting back so quickly, because Cyclops like, dude, you didn't just kill all them guards, did you? But he let him know that they more or less just attacked each other, because not long after their bodies went primal, so did their minds. But even though Magneto insists that they go after the post-human girl, Cyclops is then like, no, we got a mission to stick to, and aside from taking down this Orcis base, our main priority is saving these mutants and taking them to Krakoa, which is one of those things that subtly shows us like off the bat that the Quiet Council for the time being is still in full effect. And in addition to that, even though Magneto sits at the table within the autumn portion with the seasons, even though he made the call for them to go after the post-human girl, when Cyclops, who does not sit at the table, told Magneto no, Magneto had to listen because Cyclops is a great captain. And I don't mean just like a great captain, like he holds the title of great captain. And one thing we know about the great captain is like in the field, when they make a call, their call supersedes anyone else in the field, much like we talked about before. And once again, it's not like they can make some crazy call and it's okay, because whatever call they do choose to make, if it were to be a questionable one, then they would have to answer it to the entire council. But when they get back to Krakoa and the different mutants are getting looked after, like when the younger ones, when they see Magneto, like he's the man. And I'm not even gonna front on him, like he deserves every bit of it, because Magneto at his core, right or wrong, villain or hero, he would die for mutant kind. So they need to go ahead and just put him on the Krakoan dollar, like put his face on it, because he that guy. And just a little bit that we had seen in that field mission had been an example of all of it, when him and Polaris showed up for Storm and Cyclops, and him operating as needed to push the mission forward, and even going further with that, with him not killing the guards when old Magneto would've, and even following the lead of Cyclops, like just showing that he's a changed man, and really just being the hero that he needs to be for the people who need him the most. And in that moment, we get a glimpse of Magneto just owning it. And so when we see Cyclops, who's having this brief discussion with Polaris as he makes his way to go to like a family dinner, to which he does invite her to, but she's like, she has her own things she needs to sort out. But just before he leaves, he tells her like all of this going on with Krakoa, though it may be taking place in the middle of this messed up world, like it's all worth it. Collectively, we're as close as we've ever been, and they're literally living the dream of providing even a piece of that world to where mutants can live peacefully with support and protection from their own kind. And so following Cyclops from here to the Summer House, which is located adjacent to the blue area of the moon, to where living here you have the Summers clan, which is like the whole Summers family with the addition of a few others. And I'll admit, initially I did think that the Summer House was gonna have like your summer portion from the Quiet Council just from the name Summer House and not Summers with an S. And it's likely that this is something that caters back towards your great captains, so we may see the other three, Gorgon, Bishop, and Magic, with something similar, but we'll just have to wait and see. But as far as here, in the Summers house, we have your Summers clan, and the ones that we know that live here are Cyclops, Wolverine, Vulcan, Havoc, Cable, and Rachel. And with that, there are two additional spots that we don't know of just yet, as far as the accommodations and the way that the house is set up, but then again, those may very well just be guest rooms. But the point of the Summer House for the Summers clan, it's primarily for the use of like first response or even first strike, but with how we're introduced to it and actually seeing the inside, it's really for neither or, with the Starjammers being invited to dinner, plus a few others who Vulcan has invited from Krakoa. But one of the main takeaways that we get from this is a conversation between Scott Summers and his father Corsair. And with coming here, Corsair's getting a closer look about much of what he's heard about throughout House of X, because news travels fast, and though he's not really 100% on board with it, some of it does begin to grow on him. And there's other parts that he just can't get over, like Krakoa making plates and then cleaning them with goo, which then converts them to gases. Like, it's crazy. And he does admit, like Corsair admits, like seeing this now in comparison to the world as he knew it, like it's a pretty steep change. But when he expresses to Cyclops that the thing that's mainly bothering him underneath it all is being a human father worried about his mutant children, who are smack dab in the center of all this. But Cyclops assures him that this is nothing new, with the dangers that have been focusing on him and his brothers, that's always been the same. And the only real difference as a family is them not focusing on those dangers, but rather focusing on what they're fighting for and what they're living for. But from here, jumping over to the Orcis Forge, where we see a bit of this conversation between Karima and Director Devo. And there's quite a few things that we can take away from it, because even though on one hand they're kind of basking in the disaster of Orcis' loss of the Mother Mold, while they're also having this funeral for all the casualties of the lives lost with it, which in Karima's perspective, she tells him like it wasn't but a matter of time before this would happen. But the things that are very intriguing about this conversation are, one, after Director Devo expresses the extent of the loss that they've endured, he tells Karima like the Mother Mold, the fallen soldiers, like all of that pales in comparison to if they had lost her. And it's not even a statement of sentiment, but it's more so because she's an Omega Sentinel. And so now, in addition to Director Devo being here, shortly after the funeral service, he goes to see Dr. Gregor. And though he asks her why didn't she attend the funeral, he picks up the reason why very quickly, with her husband being lost in that attack, and especially with her being very short and crass with him in her response and her tone. But mainly her reason for not attending is much deeper than that. And after the loss of her husband, she is mad at Director Devo, she's mad at Orcis, she's mad at everything pretty much. But ever since the incident, she's been given a new motivation to make it so that her husband lives on through her work. And for me, like the craziest part out of this whole issue, it's here where she tells Director Devo that she didn't attend the funeral because her husband, he wasn't there. Like what was left of him wasn't enough to even bury or do whatever they did with those coffins. But after telling him this, in addition, she goes on to let him know that she's figured out a way to bring him back. And with telling him this, she pulls out what appears to be a shard of the M'Kraan crystal. And now seeing this, man, like this is crazy, because like the thing is, we talked about the M'Kraan crystal before, with it being the home of the Phoenix Force, with it housing the White Hot Room, and its origins going back as far as time itself. And if this is truly the case of what it appears to be, then this is going to be huge for like the next 2,000 plus years as far as what's going on, not only with the X-Men, but also with the Intergalactic Empire of Wakanda, which is something we definitely need to get back into, because even thus far on that playlist where we've gone 2,000 years into the future, where we've seen T'Challa return and join the rebellion, but also within that series, we've seen the importance of the M'Kraan crystal and its ability to restore the memories of many people further on in the future, which is pretty insane, especially with 2,000 years in the future, Storm is still around, and now we know why. So definitely sticking around for us getting back into that, because I for one am definitely looking forward to the future for both of these series. Alright, so essentially starting this off from the summer house, which we had talked about in the last video, which is located right next to your blue area of the moon. And this once again is not like just your home and lodging, but this is also like your area for Cyclops and his team of first responders, which is exactly what we see getting into this, with Cyclops walking in and telling Rachel and Cable that this island has popped up and they need to go check it out. And I'm not really sure if it's just me, but it's gonna take me a while to get used to the whole just fathering kids thing, with seeing Cyclops like, hey kids, and then Rachel and Nathan are just like, oh hey dad. Like, who would have thought that they would have got here? Not me. And it's good to see, but I admit it's gonna take some getting used to. Oh, and before I forget, one of you guys had mentioned in the comments of the last video that as far as like the seating arrangement for the rooms inside of the Summers house, with Wolverine having room 11, Jean having room 12, and Cyclops in room 10, like you guys was like, this is a setup. Like, why they got Jean's room sitting there in the middle? Like, I just imagine Cyclops looking out the door and telling Logan like, keep walking Logan, 2 doors down Logan, 2 doors down. But much like we've seen before, it's not just the Summers family home, and it's not like your seasonal group from the Quiet Council, but it's very much like we've seen like your home / first responder location. And so now when the three of them make their way to this island that just popped up out of nowhere, just 100 miles out from Krakoa, and with it showing up here, Krakoa has now been actually moving towards it. And really just this early on with only this little bit of information, it's like immediately my first guess is like that flashback with Apocalypse that we had seen back in House of X, when Cypher discovered why Krakoa was in this sad and lonely and angry kind of mood. And really it was because there was a story behind it to where we discovered that a part of Krakoa had been missing for some time. And it really feels like that part of it is pretty obvious. But even still, stepping foot on this place is a whole nother story, because we really don't know anything about this island. And really for all we know, with as cooperative as Krakoa has been, this portion of the island could be just the opposite. But so now as they're making their way through, and I gotta tell you, it just feels like something out of Predator. And really any of the Predator movies, when they're in the jungle, you just don't know what's gonna hop out. And I think another thing that kind of gives me that Predator vibe is like the way that Cable handles this, which is like in a very 2010 Predator type of way, when they spot this rhino looking creature and Cable identifies it as a herbivore, mainly because of the stocky legs and the big feet, and like for a moment it's like he's really sounding like the expert. But when the snake jumps out and eats puts it, with a head that's straight out of Stranger Things, it's like he goes from hero to Dustin real quick. And from there, everyone just let loose on it like it was go time. And they weren't even about to take the chance of trying to figure out if this thing was gonna be friendly or not, because it just ate a rhino, like come on. But at this point, when we go underneath the island, we find a man who essentially looks like Prince Nuada from Hellboy 2. I think that's his name. It was like the same dude from Blade 2. So just imagine him but completely white with his mascara running. And boom, that's your guy. And so when we see him, he's speaking in this unknown language into what appears to be a doorway and talking to a figure that we don't really get a good look at. But when he's speaking to her in this unknown language, he refers to her as mother. And to where he's essentially asking for her guidance, she just tells him that he is to find his way here, find him, and follow him. And so now a little bit more about this new guy. We come to find out that he is a summoner to whom we're able to identify by the markings on their chest what level they are, and it kind of reminds me of Contest of Champions. But between the different types of summoners, you're able to tell their level by the markings below their circle, with 1 line being a summoner minor, 2 lines a summoner adept, and 3 lines being a high summoner. To where in the case of this guy, where we see the 3 lines, we know, okay, he's a high summoner. But among the different summoners, because of this endless war on Araco, which is the name of this island that we learned back in House of X, but because of this endless war, which has taken out a number of these guys, and like well over half, because for the high summoners, though they started with 3, this guy's the last one. And for the summoners adept with the 2 lines, they started with 30, but now they got 8. And for your first level summoner minors, they started with 600, but now they're down to 250, which shows us that this endless war has been extremely harsh, and eventually, given enough time, they'll be taken out completely. But so now getting back to Cyclops and the kids, who at this point found some other of the dark rhino creatures, which they've been riding on at this point for close to an hour. And I'll admit, I do like the exchange between these 3, because it's very different from what we've seen before, because they actually come off as a family that's lived and grown with each other their entire lives, which couldn't be any further from what we're used to. But after an hour of riding, they come across our new friend, who's just standing there in the middle of the field, like just super spooky looking. And so when they see him, Cable's the first to approach, of course. And because this summoner speaks a different language, he doesn't understand them, they don't understand him. The summoner thinks they're growling, and Rachel describes the summoner's language like it sounds like it's singing. But either way, at this time, there's a huge disconnect in the communication. So Cable's like, you know what? I got a gift for you, because he figures why not go ahead and break the ice, loosen up some of this tension. But when he gives the summoner a gift, which is a thermal grenade, he then gets behind his dad and his sister, because he knows exactly what's about to go down next, because the summoner pushes the button, detonates the thermal grenade, and Rachel just gets on Cable for this. She's like, see, this is why people don't like you. And when this happens, dude is just standing there like he's completely Omarion to the impact. And it immediately turns into one of those moments where like the dude is standing there and he's yelling at them and they don't know what he's saying. But it's one of those moments where you don't have to know what he's saying. It's like you just know it's about to go down. And of course it's here where he shows us what a high level summoner is capable of. And so now these creatures that the summoner is able to summon, he's able to bring them here by bridging the gap between Araco and the land beyond the wild borders of Otherworld, with Otherworld being your pocket dimension, which we'll get much heavier into when we talk about Excalibur. But it's very similar to some of the things we touched on when we talked about Immortal Hulk and the Great Beast of the North, and even similar to like our talks of Weapon H, where we talked about Morgan Le Fay and Weird World, which also falls within your category of pocket dimensions. And so now eventually Rachel gets through to the summoner when Cyclops tells her to download the language of Krakoa into his mind so he can understand what they're saying, because essentially they do not want to fight this guy, let alone any of the Pokemon which he's bringing out. And really at the end of the day, this all started because Cable did something stupid. He knows he did something stupid, and like a man, he tells the guy to his face like, look, I did something stupid. But now that they had the language border out of the way, Cyclops asked him like, why is Krakoa heading for this island? And it's here where the summoner answers this. We learn so much about the summoner, we learn about the summoner's mother, and even the person who the summoner was sent here to find and follow. Because essentially the summoner tells Cyclops that it's about love, which is very intriguing that the summoner is aware of love, even though his mother makes mention that all he knows is war. That's what he was born in, that's what he's been in all his life, and that's what he knows. But with us getting the better understanding that this is the actual relationship between Krakoa and Akaro, as the 2 islands come together and become one again, it then shines more light about this part of Krakoa which we knew was missing. But up until this point, we never had the full understanding of the dynamic between Krakoa and Akaro. And as these 2 different islands, which were lovers, become one again, Cyclops just covers Cable's eyes like, look, you're not old enough to see this. And I just imagine the music that's playing right now, like, there's a meeting in Krakoa, with these long lost bodies of land becoming one again. But as far as what I was talking about with the summoner and the things that we learned about him and the one that he's supposed to follow, not long after we find out that this is Apocalypse, which is really not a super huge surprise the way that things led into this, but with us knowing that the summoner is first aware of what love is, even though he was born in an unending war. This first gives us the inkling that he was raised by a loving mother, and with her sending him here to find Apocalypse, to whom speaks the language already, which also makes sense given that this summoner is one of the offsprings of the Horsemen of Apocalypse who had to stay in Arakko and fight off the darkness in this unending war. And of those Horsemen of Apocalypse, we find out that his mother is War, and she sent the summoner to get Apocalypse. But when Apocalypse responds and he tells him that he will protect his children, both of Arakko and Krakoa, this is the part that is huge to me, because it's like we're finally getting a peek into the affection of Apocalypse, because he's still very much the Apocalypse who we've seen for years pushing the ideals that strength should be proven. But as far as I can remember, this is the first time where we've seen like, well, what's next? After strength is proven, then what? Because there has to be a point to where he understands that everybody is not him. Everyone is not nigh invincible. And if the concept of only the strong survive was like absolute law, then that's only a means to a very lonely end. Because at that point, you're saying like, okay, well just forget everybody who's not as strong as Apocalypse. Which at that point wouldn't make sense, because also, what about the people who are more powerful than Apocalypse? So then would he be pushed away because he's not as strong? And it's really for this reason that it feels like this is the most mature Apocalypse like that I've ever seen. And what Hickman is doing here is breaking the redundancy of this Apocalypse who at one point in time only cared about power. But now with him being tested and proving that if all of this is truly for your people, if it's truly for your horsemen and their children, then now it's like Apocalypse has finally risen to the place to where it's like now he's fighting for something. Now he's fighting for his family, to whom now we know he considers his children to be of Arakko and also those from Krakoa. Alright, so real quick, one of the first things I want to get into is like this issue going on in the Savage Land. And even though this is one of those things that I feel like is super important, but at the same time, it's not something I felt like deserved an entire video. But I definitely feel like it's something worth mentioning because it leans into this possibility of humanity stealing or even copying one of the mutants' biggest advantages. And we'll get to what I mean by that shortly. But at this point in time, when the Savage Land had been intruded by these four masked individuals who had made their way here through a Krakoan door, which initially didn't seem harmless because Pixie and everyone else here, they were just thinking like, okay, well somebody made it through the doorway because Krakoa would only allow mutants through, so there was this assumption that anyone passed through that door, they would have to be a mutant and most likely not hostile. But with this actually happening and these intruders making their way here and restraining Pixie and the others with non-lethal force, this presented a number of problems which were solved for the most part, but with doing so the biggest threat was still left out there lingering. And so now your first issue is the fact that this particular area in the Savage Land is one of your Krakoan harvest centers, meaning that it's one of the locations where the mutants provide Krakoan plants either for doorways or pharmaceuticals. And when this intrusion occurred, a quiet council meeting was immediately called in order because when this happened, a number of other things went out of whack with Krakoa, with the island shrinking 0.001% in addition to altering the amount of psychic energy that Krakoa would usually feed on, which is something we had quickly seen affect Jean, Emma, and Paris, which on the outside looked like a bit of a shorter temper or even headaches, but it was actually a side effect of them literally being drained by the island. But with the council sending Scott, Emma, and Sebastian Shaw to go and investigate and figure out what exactly had happened, this is where we get a bit of a hint of that severity that could potentially be something huge. Because even though when they arrived and they found that the threat was like this group of old ladies who go by the name of Horticulture, which is a name that Sebastian Shaw did have a little fun with, but here's the thing, not only did they make their way out without being apprehended by Cyclops and the others, which is pretty significant given that these are a bunch of old ladies with no powers but plenty of education on plants. But even with that, that's the most threatening part, because with these women being a combination of agrochemists, biotechnologists, and bioengineers who have collectively well over 2 centuries worth of practice, they've now become that next threat, and perhaps not even immediate, but with them still out there, they could very much become an issue later on down the line. Because as far as what we know at this point about Horticulture, which may be an organization with many more than just these 4 women, But with what we know about them and their plans to activate this horticultural seed, which will essentially determine what person lives and what person dies, in order to send the world back to a state where it's predominantly plant life. And this is a plan that they came up with taking many dark practices, which they believed the companies they had worked for before had used towards plants in order to make a profit, and they used those practices on the people who ran the company, and really just turned the tables on the big greedy corporations. But with them taking this a step further, and developing the group Horticulture, which prior to this point primarily had an extinction agenda, but after the predominant rise of Krakoa, they then believed that a different endgame was achievable, but only with Krakoa's help, which was why prior to them entering the Savage Land, they started with studying the different gates all around the world, but when the gates didn't provide them with enough information for their research, that's when they then came to the Savage Land and attacked the Krakoan Harvest Center, so they can get more information on Krakoa, to use the island to their benefit, and even to the extent if the island doesn't cooperate willingly, then they'll know how to make it do so forcibly. And with making this visit to the Savage Land, they successfully got the samples that they needed, which now means any day Krakoa could become the next enemy. And not just that, but also any weapons that Forges use and infuse with Krakoan organics. Like, all of that is compromised now, which is just one problem of many bubbling in the background and is definitely not to be slept on. But from there, jumping over to Davos, Switzerland, to where we have members of the Quiet Council of Krakoa attending an annual World Economic Forum. And of course, the topic for this year is globalization of a new age, which is one of your early signs, like the dawn of Krakoa as a nation, like it has literally turned the heads of the entire world. And for that reason, this gathering with a number of representatives from a number of different countries, they call for representatives of Krakoa to attend this meeting and seemingly to gain more information about the nation of Krakoa and what these other countries believe to be the mutants' secret agenda, which for the most part really isn't a secret. But I also gotta say, like, when these guys touch down, to where this time with the Quiet Council you have your Autumn group with Apocalypse, Xavier, and Magneto, who also have Cyclops and Gorgon for security, but with doing so, like, these guys are fresh, because they step out with the whole cinematic look, like bum bum bum, you know what I'm saying? Like, I don't know the exact song, but it happens in the movies, like when people step out of helicopters and stuff. But with arriving here just before the Autumn members of the Quiet Council enter in, Cyclops and Gorgon are asked to stay outside, with the addition of Gorgon being asked to turn over his sword. And really, it's like this dude has no idea how dangerous Tomichi Shido is without it. And even furthermore, Apocalypse just walked in that room, so they good. And really, even if they weren't, with a number of Cerebros being set in different locations and provisions having been made to bring them back in whatever circumstance, it's like we know that's not the actual threat, even when it's hinted to be that type of instance. But even still, like, in the back of our minds, we have to remember that Charles Xavier has expressed a number of times that even though there's contingencies for resurrecting mutants, that even still that system is not perfect. And that's something we'll get much deeper into when we get back into X-Force. But at this point in time, when there's a strike team preparing a couple floors down, to where with doing so, they have these devices on their heads that are designed to block Charles' telepathy, and one of the guys kind of messes with it, like it's kind of irritating. But just in that moment with that guy barely touching the device, he gives up his location plus a portion of his team, which allows Charles to tell Cyclops and Gorgon where the two assault teams are, and also that the guarantee of safety within this meeting was nothing more than a setup. And immediately Charles just tells Cyclops and Gorgon just to handle it. But even still, with the Autumn members being aware of what's happening above and below the room, they continue to conduct business within this meeting. And really, from the moment that they step in there, there's no beating around the bush. And the question about their motives and their reasoning for establishing Krakoa as a nation, like, that's what a number of these guys lead with. But even with this, I like with Hodari from Wakanda, who's one of the few here who's really oblivious to what's truly going on as far as the assault teams and all that. But I really like how Hodari and Magneto, they have a bit of this exchange to where they share a couple laughs, and Eric is like, oh great, so that means that you'll change your mind about the trade restrictions between Krakoa and Wakanda. And Hodari's like, no. Like, what you thought this was, bruh? But when others propose the idea of, if the mutants are so free with this information, then why are they hiding? And Apocalypse was just like, does this feel like we're hiding? But while this is happening, directly below and directly above, Cyclops and Gorgon had split up so that they can neutralize both of these assault teams, or in other words, handle it like Charles said. And this is one of those things to where during the meeting, the same guy, he keeps looking at his watch, almost as if he's expecting someone, and he keeps going back from looking to his watch to going to his earpiece, and he's constantly doing so in a very suspicious way. But amongst this meeting, you have questions which are brought up by members like Ma Mingyao, who's your ambassador for China, who questions the frequency of the Krakoan prescription drugs, and really like with him questioning it, it's almost like him saying, do we need to buy this much from you? But even still, it's like Magneto assures him that the recommended doses are necessary for the drugs to run their course and eventually contribute their miraculous benefits. So it's not like it's a watered down situation that's only a cash grab, because for like what these drugs can do, humanity cannot replicate, and if they could, they would. But since they can't, and on top of that, even more important, the world knows about it, so for that reason these other countries can't just sweep it under the rug and just say, oh, we didn't know that there was a cure for this form of cancer. And that was a brilliant move which they don't really talk about right here, but it was one of those moves by Charles to where with making the world aware of it, it kind of forced the hand of the other countries to figure out a way to distribute it, with the exception of those like Wakanda who have their other means, or other nations with strict anti-mutant policies who at the end of the day just don't want it because it's coming from Krakoa. And when they're asked like how do the other nations know that they're not a threat, Magneto just tells them the same as any other nation. Like it's really no different, because just like any other nation in the world, every other nation in the world to some extent is just gonna have to take them at their word. But from here, where Magneto gets into what Krakoa will be doing differently, it comes about when Magneto gives a quote from Aldous Huxley, expressing the 3 pillars of Western philosophy, of which he's patronized for quoting a human and not a mutant, but he does rebuttal that there will be historical mutants to quote at some point in the future. But with continuing with this point, he goes on to tell them that humanity has their cycles, like the medieval socialites who got their lead from stealing technology from Roman ruins, but eventually that was lost in the Dark Ages, which wasn't even the first time that happened, because before that you even had the Bronze Age. But with expressing this cycle, this is where Magneto is trying to tell them that the mutants will be different, because as they proceed to excel, and they will, it's like here they're pretty much declaring that they're not going to have a Dark Age, or even a Bronze Age for that matter. And when one of them asks like, why should we even care about the Bronze Age? And Apocalypse replies, because he was alive then. And another guy's like, oh, if you was there, what ended it? And Apocalypse is just like, me. And I'm sorry, like if I was there, that'd have been the only thing I heard, and I'd be like, wait, what? But this just proved Magneto's point so well, with the whole idea of humanity rising to power by shady means, then holding that power for a brief moment only for it to be taken by someone else. And hundreds of years later, whoever has the power then, they just make up the history that they want and they teach it to the next generation. And Magneto is telling them here that the mutants are going to do this different, because they're going to do it better. And with Apocalypse sitting in the room, it doesn't even need to be said that they don't plan on facing a Dark Age or any Bronze Age, because the person who ended their Bronze Age is sitting at the table. Like what a statement. But what's also crazy, like on the lower level with Cyclops, who at this time is still linked with everyone through Charles Xavier, but when Cyclops gets in a pinch with 2 different guards to where he's tied up with one and the other guard is about to shoot him, from all the way upstairs, Magneto just tosses the guy's gun to the other side of the room, which is pretty crazy. But after this, Magneto continues to further explain to them, and once again keeping that transparency with telling them the plans of the nation of Krakoa, but at this point being way more thorough, because with them assuming that this rise to power will have to be done by war, Magneto assures them that it doesn't, because with these miraculous drugs that they will buy that they can't produce themselves, that will prolong human life and also bring their governments money, which other governments will use for means of greed and lavishness. But as for the nation of Krakoa, they're going to reinvest that money. They're going to use it to buy banks, schools, media, politicians, because humanity has taught them that everything has a price tag on it, and for that reason, after they buy everything, they're gonna buy them. And once the nation of Krakoa has the power over the institutions, the economy, the media, and so on, they'll be in full control of who gets in. So in the case of those who hate mutant kind and wish them harm, their resources will be scarcely limited. And it's an amazing speech if I say so myself, because essentially Magneto's come to this meeting and declared world domination, but for the greater good of everyone on the planet. And I'm not sure if you guys caught it, but even in a way he kind of told on himself with the analogy of the medieval stealing technology to advance their society, because it was almost like dry snitching on the Marauders, but it flew over their heads. Like they had no inkling of what that truly translated to. But on the other levels, as far as Scott and Gorgon, Scott manages to take down all the soldiers with a number of concussive blasts, rendering them unconscious, when all the while Gorgon was upstairs going Salt Bay on people's limbs. But also with doing this, Gorgon leaves the commander alive, which may be something that comes back later on, but it's hard to tell because a lot of these dudes lost a lot of blood, so if any of them live long enough to get enhancements, then they deserve a cookie for doing that alone. But as the meeting downstairs wraps up, and the same dude I was telling you about who's checking his earpiece, checking his watch, like once the top and bottom floors are secure, Magneto just tells the dude like the guys you're waiting on, they're not coming. And essentially from here it goes over to Charles, who removes Cerebro, and he tells them that they've tried to kill him before. And the way that he says it, like he can't be killed, not by the likes of them, it's a little condescending, but even still with doing so, not at all out of proportion, because he's essentially telling them that humanity does not have the means to quench their hatred for mutants just by murdering them, which I think is the most interesting thing about Hickman's decision for there being a way for mutants to come back from death. And even though this system isn't perfect, like we know there's a slim chance that someone can die indefinitely, which is something we haven't come to yet, but this is one of those things to where if humanity can't just kill mutants to get rid of them because they don't like them, then it challenges them to find another resolve. And I really feel like with that, this huge underlining of this new age of X-Men, it begs the question like, will humanity get better, or will they refuse to change and just continue to bang their head into the wall over and over again? But at this point in time, where the autumn portion of the Quiet Council begins to leave, Magneto essentially tells them like this is strike two. Like if they try this again, that they should expect a response. And this is pretty huge because we've seen the mutants turn their cheek twice as far as high-level assassination attempts, and for that reason, if the humans make another move, then retaliation from Krakoa is far beyond justified. But I also want to mention, because I know a lot of you are wondering, like with the thumbnail of this video talking about a plan that's almost perfect, well, that's the part I want to talk about real quick. Because with much of Krakoa's plans being centered around their production of pharmaceuticals, we still got to keep in mind the threat of horticulture and their mission to activate the horticulture seed, which was a mission that was recently updated, with horticulture also wanting to use Krakoa as an ally to their cause. And we got to keep in mind, like with this viable threat still out there, that if successful, they could bring the nation of Krakoa to its knees, in doing so by fulfilling their own extinction agenda, but in this case using Krakoan pharmaceuticals to choose who lives and dies when the time comes and they activate the horticulture seed. Alright, so just to give a better explanation of where we're picking up at this point, we gotta step back and take like 20 seconds to do a quick refresher. Because if you guys remember, back in the first issue of Dawn of X, we had seen times where Scott and Storm would lead teams to where they would visit these different Orcis camps, and do so mainly with the objective of shutting them down and also freeing the mutants which were held captive by them. But where we had also seen at one point in time was them bring this to this girl by the name of Seraphina, who is one of the children of the Vault who they had released at the time, and immediately after letting her out, she just disappeared. And although back at the time Magneto and Polaris wanted to pursue her, but Cyclops had said no because the priority at the time was freeing the mutants and getting them to safety. And it's really what happened in that moment, which fast forward brings us to here, to where they've eventually got a hit on Seraphina's location in Ecuador. And this location is actually a bit of a throwback when it comes to the Children of the Vault, because at one point in time they actually faked their death here in order to get away from the X-Men. But we'll get back to more of that in just a little bit. But at this point here with Seraphina, she uses some of the locals really just to mind control and tell them to stop someone from following her, to whom, as we find out, that someone is Wolverine. And so one of the things we had seen earlier throughout Dawn of X is that Seraphina's abilities just didn't work on the X-Men, because essentially she has mind control and cloaking, and I want to say also technokinesis, much like Black Box, who we had talked about back when we were heavy in the 1610 universe. But aside from that, like when the X-Men originally encountered the Children of the Vault, like before Dawn of X powers and 10 and all of that, when Seraphina's powers did work on the X-Men, she would mess them up pretty bad. And back at the time, I want to say Sabretooth was one of the first to find out, and it was like one of those things like when you see Sabretooth suffers, like nobody cares. And I could probably make a Sabretooth suffering playlist at this point, but I don't know if anybody cared. But on the flip side of this, when she would usually use either her cloaking or manipulate the minds of the different X-Men to drop them in some type of illusion, at the time Wolverine was the most keen to this, because with his other senses he could tell that something was off. But even with this, like at the time, like people like Cannonball, who did fall victim to her influence, like for example, he was dropped within an illusion, which in real time was like a matter of minutes, I think it was, but for him it felt like years. But with Seraphina using these locals to slow down Wolverine, she probably didn't put into consideration two things. One, these dudes can fight, and two, Wolverine's been fighting for close to a century at this point. And because of that, with Wolverine not feeling threatened at all, and knowing that these guys are pretty much just innocent bystanders, he really just takes them down quickly without popping claws. And if anything, I only feel bad for the dude who got punched, because in all actuality, Wolverine is always punching with weighted gloves. So sorry to that man. But eventually where this takes us, as Wolverine follows Seraphina's scent, this leads us back to the the vault. And when Wolverine gets there, even though there's like a physical door, he's not able to pass through because only those who are permitted in at a specific frequency would be allowed inside without just dying. So Wolverine just pulls up and he's like, you know what, let me make a call real quick. But also at this location, this is the Wild Master mode that essentially was part of your Wild Sentinel factory, which we had talked about not too long ago on the House of X playlist, where we did a bit of our refresher on Cassandra Nova. And I got a link below for House of X if you need to catch up with that, because I'm pretty sure on that playlist we talked about it like in the first video. But what's crazy is how we come back here within Dawn of X and the way that this ties into the Children of the Vault, because it really feels like we're picking up back where that had left off in like X-Men Volume 2 issue 193. Because with the Children of the Vault, who were like a different race in its own, with them neither being considered a human or mutant species, but rather they were a product of temporal acceleration, which was supposed to be designed to accelerate more generations to maturity in a shorter amount of time. But instead what had happened while they were on the ship, where they were left at sea for over 3 decades, they then evolved over 6,000 years, which is why they're mainly categorized as something completely different, because it's not like an activation of the X gene, which in that case they would then be categorized as mutants. But instead, with this different process yielding a completely different result, it's like then they fall into neither category, either human or mutant. But essentially with the Children of the Vault having this ideal to where they believe that the strongest species should rule the earth. And like with the Children of the Vault saying that, like I can imagine Apocalypse just jumping in and be like, yeah, these dudes are spitting. Like Children of the Vault? Bars. But essentially with them having this belief and being discovered by Sabretooth earlier than what they had planned, this had then drew the attention of others a lot sooner than what they had planned, because ideally they wanted to grow in secret and then attack at a quieter time. But back at the time when it came down to them going toe to toe with the X-Men, it is believed that they had been killed off with the destruction of their ship, which for the most part is essentially what had taken them off of the X-Men's radar. But with the X-Men believing this, like ever since then we have always gotten this teaser that they have been living within that Wild Master mode, and like as a cover up, like back when their ship was destroyed, they had reshaped like a bunch of animal carcasses, so it would appear that they had died in the explosion, but when all the while they had been here in Ecuador. And really since then they've been plotting their comeback. And when I say comeback, I'm not necessarily counting what happened in X-Men Legacy, when they were more so searching for Luz, who had escaped and they came after her, because that also ended with them crashing something else into something else. But fast forward to where we're at now with Seraphina going inside of this vault, to where at this time we see her authentication process to where she crosses over to her extra dimensional city, which is where more specifically the other Children of the Vault reside. But so when we get over to the X-Men, who understand that the Children of the Vault, they are as much of a threat to the mutants as the mutants are potentially to the humans. And it's for this reason that Cyclops selects to send Darwin, Synch, and X-23, who he believes collectively like these are the 3 that are most likely to make it through, with Darwin having the ability to adapt to pretty much anything, and Synch literally having the ability to synchronize with any other mutant and copy their abilities. And then after that, Lord Kinney, who's the daughter of Wolverine and just inherently has his healing factor. And I gotta say, like, it is pretty messed up though. And we did talk about this for a bit in the last Wolverine video, but I'm just gonna say it again because all because this dude has a healing factor, and in this case more specifically is Lord Kinney, like all because someone has a healing factor, people like Cyclops gotta make the calls and just throw them under the bus and be like, hey, you'll live. And it's just like, man, can I go around the bus, bro? Like, do I gotta go up under it? Like, I feel all that. But Cyclops just doesn't seem to understand. Like, his name is Cyclops, but you get it? Like, he doesn't see. Alright, but either way. But in the case of Seraphina, whose entrance authorization is still processing. Like, what is this thing? Like, Pentium powered? Like, what's going on? And like, this whole time, Seraphina just sitting there like, okay, like I knew I shouldn't have did that last update. But really what's happening here is that her entry is not being cleared because she's flagged for mission failure, in addition to increasing the threat level, which then triggers her scan to send reinforcements, which truth be told would be an accurate assessment. But one thing that this also showed the X-Men was that with Seraphina acting alone, which is also something that the Children of the Vault never do, but with her doing this, it kind of showed their hand that they're still in a growth cycle. But it's also at this time that the X-Men start to implement Cyclops' plan. And with doing so, they trigger the defense protocols so that Darwin, Lord Kinney, and Synch can use this opportunity to make their way in. But when they do this and they make their way inside, they set off all kinds of flags. Because when they go in, the scan just hits them with the, if you don't get your unidentified, asymmetrical, super contagion body face It's up out of here. And I'm paraphrasing, but still. But more or less, they're gonna face some resistance. But when this happens, we jump forward about 3 months to where you can tell Cyclops has been thinking about this non-stop. But according to the information that Sabretooth had given the X-Men a long time ago, like back when he first encountered the Children of the Vault, like this lets them know that 3 months is about 537 years, given their accelerated time on the inside. And when Cyclops hears this, man, he's just like, man, like what did I do? And I'm telling you, like, for you guys who are following the X-Force playlist, mark my words, Hank McCoy is gonna have a moment just like Scott did right here. Like, it is coming. But so now real quick, just wanna give a shout out to all the Patreons. Thank you all for your support, because what you guys do is a huge help, and it really allows me to do more one spill at a time. And for anybody who would like additional information on how to become a patron, I got a link below, patreon.com/DopeSpill. But that'll do it for this one, guys. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below, because with Laura, Sink, and Darwin for 3 months rather than 3 decades, which equates to about 500 years versus 6,000, at this point they're likely at 8% of the increase from what we had seen of the Children of the Vault. So the next time we see them, they might be a little different. And it's really hard to gauge how different, because the Children of the Vault, they started as human, so it's kind of tough to tell with 3 who started as mutants. So it's almost like comparing apples and oranges. So with that said, it can be a minor change or it could be a major change. Alright, so jumping right back in, a lot of this is going to revolve around the X-Men's attack on the Orcis Forge, which they executed with the intention of minimizing human casualties, but even with doing so, there was an extreme number of casualties, with Dr. Gregor's husband sacrificing himself in order to stop the mutants, which then pushed her dedication meter through the roof. And with doing so, not only did it make her hatred for mutants more fervent, but it also led her to believe that what was left of her husband would continue in her work. And this is what we had seen back in Dawn of X issue 1, where it appeared that she had created some type of pink crystal that looked much like a shard of the M'Kraan crystal, or perhaps even a Shi'ar memory crystal, much like we had heard Charles mention the Forge when it came to resolving the issue of having enough memory to back up mutants with Cerebro. And at this point, I'm leaning more towards the Shi'ar memory crystal, and I'll tell you guys why in just a moment. But when we had first seen Dr. Gregor with this crystal, while standing with Director Devo, which is also important, but while holding this crystal, she tells Director Devo that she knows how to bring her husband back. But as a result of this, we had also seen Director Devo create a device that would house the crystal, which is also something that Director Devo described as a work of art, much like the Omega Sentinel Karima, which feels like a bit of foreshadowing for the purpose of this actual device. But with doing this to hand the device to someone to hand over to Dr. Gregor, but not without having a candid conversation of how Dr. Gregor is so emotionally involved with this project, and how what she's doing here is very personal to her. And when the device gets delivered to her, and we see her place it with the other pieces she's been working on, which also have the same color glow of that crystal, which yet again is most likely a Shi'ar memory crystal, it's here where we then see her place them in the body of a torso, which for her is part of her progress of not only devotion to the cause of Orcis, but also bringing her husband back. And for Orcis, it doesn't stop here, because they have defense systems orbiting around Mercury, a watchtower on Venus, and as far as Sentinel City, which is where they called for backup when the Forge had been attacked by the X-Men. Sentinel City at this point continues to expand, but now with the addition of bunkers post the attack on Mother Mold, which are there most likely as a precaution and a safety measure for Orcis, so that in the event that they are caught off guard again, or if some disaster takes place in Sentinel City, they have somewhere to go. But so now in the case of Mystique, and for her going back to not long after her, Toad, and Sabretooth had stolen information which had made the attack on the Mother Mold possible, it's here where we go back to that conversation between her and Charles, where she had hesitated to give him the information they had stolen, telling Charles that she wanted something more. With of course Charles knowing what she was referring to, being Irene Adler, also known as Destiny, who we had talked about much more in depth during the time of House of X and Powers of 10, and at that time we had went deeper into Destiny's history and the relationship between Mystique and Destiny over the years. And although Mystique has had her share of lovers and friends before marrying Destiny and even after Destiny's death, but even so, Destiny hands down is the love of Mystique's life. And at this point with Charles bringing everyone back, to where in some cases mutants who had been dead for a long time, but for some reason that's not the case for Destiny, and Mystique wants her back. But also with Destiny being a precog, we do get a bit of a flashback into a moment to some point in time when Destiny was still alive and she gave Mystique a warning about Charles Xavier and Krakoa as it would be today, which is something that I believe that she is very mindful of, because when she gives Charles the information, they discover the mother mold and Charles pretty much tells her, we're sending a team out there, we need you to go with them because number one, this threat is the priority and this is what needs to be handled first, which we had seen at the time how that had played out with pretty much everything going downhill for all the X-Men and just about everyone dying on that mission. But also with this, Mystique had made an agreement with Charles that if she were to do this one more thing, then in return she would get Irene back. But even with executing her mission and giving her life to do so, when she returned, Xavier and Magneto had told her that they weren't sure if she completed her mission, which yet again turned into another situation of we need one more thing and after that you'll get what you want. But even with this, I've been thinking like an argument could be made that Xavier and Magneto, and at least Xavier, know very well that Mystique did finish her mission, because the whole time that the team was up there, Jean had everyone linked while also communicating with Charles nearly step by step and beat by beat. So it's much more likely that he does know she completed it, but either way he sends her back not only to give her the runaround, but also likely execute another objective. And this is where I believe we really get our hidden gem. Pun intended, because when Mystique goes back to see if her flower had been planted and also check the status of Dr. Gregor's work, it's here where we also see that she had overheard the conversation between Karima and the director, and she had also got a peek into what Dr. Gregor was doing, which also showed us that Mystique is aware of Dr. Gregor's capabilities of bringing someone back. And even while leaving, when Mystique had the opportunity to kill Dr. Gregor, she didn't, and I believe her reason for doing so is because she needs Dr. Gregor to complete her work. And so when she gets back and she shares with Xavier and Magneto what she's found. On the surface, though we see Nimrod is being built much sooner than he should be, but even still there's so much more here that shouldn't be overlooked. Because one, even with doing this and keeping up her part of the bargain, now all of a sudden the terms change and she needs to earn a level of trust to bring Irene back. And she's giving complaints like, why didn't you kill Dr. Gregor when you had the chance? Even though it's their law not to kill humans, so she's clearly being given the runaround. But even in this moment, she doesn't argue, she just tells them she'll go back tomorrow, and when she does, she'll do what needs to be done. And with that being said, I'ma tell you what needs to be done. But before that, I want to talk about Charles for just a moment, because remember, between Charles, Magneto, and Moira, they're really the secret leaders of everything going on in Krakoa. And as we know, like as far as the Quiet Council, they're really just the appearance of leadership, and aside from that, really just the council that delegates politics with other countries or missions for different teams for import and export. But really and truly, these three are the main ones who know about Moira's previous lifetimes, and they're setting in place the true decisions and really just holding puppet strings over the Quiet Council. But in the case of Charles, who I do not doubt still has feelings for Moira, and because of that, he's gonna tailor the leadership to protect her at all costs. And even though, as far as we know, Moira is going in the footsteps of helping mutant kind, much like Destiny had threatened her to do, but even with doing so, if you guys remember, to send that message, Destiny had Pyro kill Moira slowly, just so she would remember that message. And with Moira sharing these memories with Charles, which would practically make him relive this moment with her, you can understand why, even if she didn't ask, like if Moira didn't even ask, why Charles won't allow Destiny to come back. But from here, going back to Mystique, and just after her conversation with Charles, where she told him she'll go back to Dr. Gregor tomorrow, that Nimrod's not that far along and it can wait. But right after this conversation with Charles, she goes back to a part of Krakoa called the Oracle, which is where we see a bit more of that personal flashback between her and Destiny watching the sunset, which is a point in time in the past where Destiny had warned Mystique about Krakoa, about Charles, and the possibility that he would refuse to bring her back. And at the time so long ago, Destiny's words came of those as a precognition, and Mystique hearing them at the time, she didn't know what they meant. But Destiny also let Mystique know that at this time when it came, that they would make a promise to her but do everything in their power not to fulfill it, and mainly for the purpose of keeping Mystique blind. But Destiny urged Mystique to bring her back, but if the leaders refused to do so, then burn that place to the ground. And so for one, as far as bringing Destiny back, we know that Charles isn't having that. But also, in addition to this, like before Destiny had actually died, she had also prophesied to Mystique that after her death she would have a relationship with Forge, which did play out for a little bit throughout X Factor, but later on it really turned into one of those things to where he was more in love with her than she was with him. And I feel like that's one of those things that we're gonna see come back, if we haven't already, with Mystique using Forge to bring back Destiny, with Forge having access to Cerebro and the Shi'ar memory crystals, to where at this point he's likely responsible for building the location called the Oracle and placing Irene's consciousness within this place so that Mystique could have a part of her. But also, theoretically, if Mystique were to take this crystal that she had got from Forge and place that crystal inside of Nimrod instead of Dr. Gregor's husband, then who better to burn that place to the ground than Irene herself? But even to take it a step further, with just the whole idea of Mystique manipulating Forge and just playing off of the idea that he still has feelings for her, then this could also potentially lead to us finding out that she had leaked Forge's research to Dr. Gregor, giving her knowledge of Shi'ar memory crystals, and doing so as a form of a backup plan for Dr. Gregor to do for Mystique unknowingly in the event that Charles wouldn't keep his word. And with Mystique at this point being set to go back the next day, if she were to find a way to put Destiny's memories in Nimrod's body, then there's no question that Destiny would want Moira and the others to burn to the ground, which wouldn't be the first time for one of them, because Moira would definitely be like, not again, Alright, so jumping right in and starting with Melody Guthrie, to whom it's really from her perspective where we discover what exactly the Crucible is. And for Melody, who's one of the siblings of Sam Guthrie, Cannonball, she's a prime example for getting into this, with her being the first candidate that we see approaching the Crucible, which essentially is an opportunity for her to get her powers back, since M-Day when Scarlet Witch had said no more mutants, which at the time reduced the mutant population about 90%, and not just in the main 616, but it had effects that echoed throughout the Marvel multiverse. And this is where a lot of what we've been talking about starts to connect in a crazy way. And not to go too deep into it, but I do want you guys to keep this one thing like in the back of your mind, because in X Factor Volume 3, I think it was, when Forge merged Nimrod's technology with Cerebro, he at the time discovered a way to look into different Earths, and when he did this while also scanning for mutant activity, post M-Day, much of it came back flatline, and most likely as a product from what Scarlet Witch had done. But at the time with Forge doing this, which is much likely a behavior he's going to repeat soon because of his feelings for Mystique and Mystique recently discovering Nimrod, there's a high probability that she'll give that information to Forge so that she can either get Destiny back or fulfill her request. But also with knowing this, in addition to what we know Apocalypse is working on within Excalibur, with him now pursuing the Starlit Citadel, which once again is your center of the multiverse, and with being so having access to the entire multiverse, which really lines things up for Melody to be like the example of the first of many. And I feel like she was a good selection for somebody for us to see go through this. Because back in Decimation, in New X-Men issue 20, which was like one example of the reaction of a number of mutants losing their powers, Melody was one that took a leap of faith believing that she still had her powers and nearly died because she didn't. And back at that time, we had seen a number of reactions from different people who had lost their powers. And even in some cases, some who didn't lose their powers and wished that they did. Whether they just wanted, quote, a normal appearance or to be more human. But for Melody, she very much wishes to have her powers back. And with simply hearing the name of the ceremony which will give her that opportunity, it brings tears to her eyes. And so now from here, going over to the summer house to where we get this conversation where Scott approaches Logan. And there's a few things to take from this, because one, Scott makes the attempt to reach out to Logan by inviting him out on a trip with the family. And this is also what I was referring to recently in our talks about the Wolverine series, because in this moment there is more to it, with Scott extending this branch, but also with Scott being a captain above commanders in Krakoa. At some point he had to see fit for Logan to live in the summer home. But that's the reason why we're talking about in the Wolverine series, which takes place after this conversation. But in this moment where Scott said nothing, it was very much like their history and their present circumstance was just screaming in that room. But on top of that, in the more immediate situation that was happening, there was this instance of Scott feeling uncomfortable about the upcoming Crucible, and with Logan pretty much telling him like, look, if you're looking for comfort, go find a priest, to where more specifically he was referring to Kurt, which then led Scott to go seek out Kurt. But I gotta say here, like, when Scott makes his way back to Krakoa, and with doing so looking for Nightcrawler, of course, but when he does and he sees Cypher, Krakoa, and Warlock sitting together, and then he does a double take and Warlock isn't there, because when Scott looks back, Warlock is no longer in the chair, and it appears that he's back on Doug's arm, which isn't necessarily a new thing, because we've seen this back when the transmode virus was a thing, and Warlock discovered that he could physically merge with Cypher. But just with the fact of him disappearing, when Scott seeing him on Crucible Day, and I just feel like it's this weird energy with Warlock warlock being an alien and not a mutant, to where he's like, oh, let me get out of here, don't want to get deported. At least that's just what crossed my mind in the moment. But with Scott making his way and finding Kurt, gazing on this beautiful view of these structures that he'd recently discovered, and more specifically as far as the tall one with the forked towers, and with knowing that it's hollow, but with knowing that there are no physical doors, and word of mouth being that there's no way inside, but also word of mouth being Logan telling Kurt that, hey man, somebody with 3 claws tried to claw their way in, but it ain't happening. But you ain't here from me, bub. Which of course was clearly Logan. But he couldn't get through because every time he would claw at it, it would just seal itself back up. And I could definitely see this happen with Logan, who's usually just running around through Krakoa for no reason, and him stumbling upon this structure and just going ham for like 15 hours straight, and then just being like, stupid structure, and just walking away. But in the case of Kurt, who admits that he let his curiosity get the best of him, and he takes the risk of teleporting inside with it being out of his field of view, which in the wrong circumstance can get him killed, but even in that case, like a good neighbor, the 5 will just bring it back. But even still, it don't mean death don't hurt. But even on top of that, lucky for Kurt, the blind jump, it worked. But when he got inside, he noticed that everything in there looked as if it had been designed by him or specifically for him, but it was all exactly the way that he would have wanted it, almost as if he had made it for himself. And initially it freaks him out, and Scott pretty much just tells him like he doesn't have to look for flaws in everything, and for some things you just have to accept them as they are. And I'll go a bit deeper into what I believe this building could be after we talk more about the Crucible, but for now just keep in mind this building without doors, and the inside being modeled as if Kurt designed it himself, almost as if it's a tribute. But right after this, when they begin to make discussion of the Crucible, with this day being the big day, they both express that they're feeling uneasy about this happening and watching someone die. But right after this, and getting closer to around the time where the Crucible begins, we go over to Exodus, who's telling the younger children about the Crucible, why it's a thing, and where exactly it came from. And it's here where he pretty much tells them the story of M-Day and Decimation, with Scarlet Witch saying no more mutants, which like I mentioned took the power of 90% of mutants, and from there he goes into a bit of the decimation that it took place after. But with this, the children also refer to Scarlet Witch as Pretender, and they cover their ears as if the sound of her name is like speaking of the devil himself. But with Scarlet Witch doing this and turning a majority of mutants into humans, Exodus tells them that she took away the mutants' gifts, which is exactly what the humans wanted. But in response to that, the Crucible is a way of telling Scarlet Witch and the humans no more. But also leading all the way up to the ceremony, Kurt and Scott have been having a conversation to where Kurt, because he has a seat on the council, he's able to give Scott more of the inside details. And he lets Scott know like part of the argument with having a Crucible to where a victim of M-Day had to fight and die and also theoretically live forever, that this had to come at some sort of price. Because if it was free and every mutant, like nearly 1 million mutants, had to go through the 5 and be restored by Charles like one at a time, like they'd have to bring back Charles from old age just to keep the wheels going. Like imagine how long that would take. So part of it did feed into the politics, but ultimately the suggestion came from Apocalypse of what we heard him say before about the humans, that they hate the mutants, they envy the mutants, and he also brings all that here directly in the ceremony with Melody, who is human at this point, and Apocalypse making her identify with these flaws that humans have, more specifically the jealousy, and identifying with it as the first step. And it's very much a process of humiliation before honor, but also biblical, like humble yourself to be exalted. And he does the same with asking her name, to where she responds with her mutant name Arrow. And Apocalypse really makes it sink in like, no, that's the name of what was stolen from you, and really just making the separation between what she was and what she is now. And of course, this is tough for her brother Sam to watch. But when the trial goes underway to where essentially she just needs to fight long enough to prove that she's worthy. But while watching this, Kurt begins to make some of the comments about how this conflicts with his faith. Because with mutants deeming themselves to have the ability to grant others with this eternal life to where they would pretty much just continue in this life, it then begins to negate the purpose of believing in something after this life. And he makes a very valid point, because if you could literally see salvation, then immediately faith is off the table. Because at that point, you no longer have to have faith for what you don't see. And he's very right about that, because you would still have hope. And I mean like a whole lot of hope with people just coming back right after they die. But in this case, with it essentially being a faithless practice, Kurt finds much conflict within himself, and this pretty much being the only option. But in addition to this, you also have like the issue of the wills, which are essentially these requests that M-Day victims have made as far as how they'll be brought back. And some of those requests out of those wills were like straight up ridiculous, because in some cases you had mutants who wanted to come back not only with their powers but also with all the powers of Magneto. And I know I said that sounded ridiculous, but If I were to get in the ring with Apocalypse and fight to my death to become a mutant again, I would want a new mutant body with everything on it. And I mean like a double stack, triple omega, matter manipulating, shape shifting, Apocalypse now, Apocalypse later. Like, I would want it all, so I can understand it. But practically that's unreasonable, which is the main conflict between the Quiet Council and those wills. But in the case of Melody, who's pretty much just fought her heart out, and her brother's in the crowd rooting her on, because when it comes down to it, he knows that this is what she wanted. And getting into the part where Apocalypse goes for that final blow, Magneto's looking like, hey, watch this part, this is a good part. But Charles is like, let me make sure she's backed up before it's too late. No, I'm just playing. But could you imagine like Apocalypse finishing her, and Charles walking out after like, okay, wait a minute, I messed up. That's my bad. Her name was Melody, I thought y'all said Melanie. But let me stop, that's so messed up. But either way, she passes the test, the resurrection is a success, and she's born again as a mutant, once again possessing her powers, and no longer just human. And it gets Apocalypse a bit choked up. I'm like, look at you, give me a minute. And I imagine like when no one was looking, he was like deep breathing and fanning his eyes. But when he pulled himself together, he just told Melody to show the others what you've earned and what you've taken back, which was stolen from you. And this is one of the things, because when everyone sees this, it's in this moment when Kurt sees this and he says that he thinks that he needs to start a new mutant religion. And with Kurt saying this is what takes me back to the structure which we had seen, which he believed to be perfect as if he would have designed it himself. And with hearing his comments and seeing this structure, it immediately makes me think of the Cardinal mutants, which we'd seen in Powers of 10, to where in that future they had no name, they were very religious, though we didn't get any information on what religion that was. But the nameless mutant who we had seen as an example, he very much resembled Kurt, but he was referred to as Cardinal since that was the name of his class. But also keep in mind, with Mora also bringing back the stolen Nimrod production date, but in addition to that, that crystal could have had much more information on it. Like for example, Rasputin, Cardinal the Nameless, and many of those influences could have made their way into this lifetime, which then leaves that possibility for the Cardinal influences to make their way here. But that'll do it for this one, guys. Just wanted to add a few thoughts because the potential buried within Dawn of X is just insane. But real quick, just want to give a shout out to all the Patreons. Thank you guys for all of your support. And for anyone who wants more information on how to become a Patreon, I got a link down below to where you can head to patreon.com/DopeSpill. But also I gotta say, before I forget, like just as an afterthought, because within Decimation, as a direct byproduct of M-Day, there were plenty of mutants who were in despair after losing their powers, but on the other hand, like Mercury for example, she was devastated that she did not lose her powers, and I would like to see a bit more of that moving forward as well. But we'll see. But either way, that'll do it for this one, guys. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below, and we'll do it again in the next one. Alright, later.